Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kathleen Sprouse Cummings. I'm a faculty member in the departments of History and American Studies at Notre Dame, and I'm also the director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, which is sponsoring this event. Like everybody else, as we tried to figure out what our path forward would be during this time when the pandemic keeps us physically apart, those of us at the Cushwa Center, we're trying to figure out what we do about hosting and sponsoring events. There was no question that we would go dark for an extended time. But at the same time, we didn't want to just migrate all of our events just online, just pretend like nothing had changed and just try to do that. So we were very judicious in thinking about what were the kinds of events that would entice people to spend an extra hour or so on Zoom. And I really think that this event fits that bill, and I'm very grateful to Heath and Katherine for joining us today to discuss religious biography. And I'm very grateful to Philip Byers, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Cushwa Center this year. This event is really his brainchild, and he helped conceptualize it and organize it. So I'm very pleased to turn it over to Philip now to introduce our featured speakers today. Thanks, Philip.
Thank you, Kathy. I want to echo Kathleen's welcome to all our virtual guests. And I also want to make sure to foreground our appreciation to the good folks at ND Studios who, along with Cushwa Center stalwarts, Madonna Noak and Shane Ulbrich, have really helped make this event possible today. For 45 years now, the Cushwa Center has been working to promote and encourage the scholarly study of the American Catholic tradition. But those of you who are old friends and frequent partners will know that our interests exceed the bounds of that formal mission, evidenced perhaps most clearly by our decades-long sponsorship of the semi-annual Seminar in American Religion. Our programs survey the rich variety of American religious history, and in recent years, that has included a sprinkling of events centered on religious lives. So next spring, Alicia Kaufman from Baylor University will be joining us to speak about her forthcoming book on the spirituality of the anthropologist Margaret Mead. And other programs of note have included a lecture by the historian John Wilsey, a seminar on Catherine O'Donnell's biography of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, an interview with journalist Eileen Markey on her book about the assassination of Sister Maura Clark, as well as a symposium honoring the career and life of theologian Elizabeth Johnson, CSJ. Whether we intended it or not, our programming has reinforced the notion that individual lives have mattered for how we understand religious history. So part of our interest today includes thinking about biography from a point of remove, engaging some conceptual questions about its place in our field. But we count it an additional privilege when programs on topics of interest also help us to highlight scholars whose work we esteem. And it's in that spirit that I'm very pleased this afternoon to welcome as our conversation partners, Professors Heath Carter and Kathryn Gin Lum, two of the three co-editors of the William B. Eerdmans Publishing Company's long-running series, The Library of Religious Biography. Heath Carter is Associate Professor of American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary, where his teaching and writing focus on the intersection of Christianity and American public life. He holds a BA in English and Theology from Georgetown University, an MA from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and to our great and abiding pride, a PhD from University of Notre Dame in history. Before assuming his current position in 2019, he spent 7 years on the faculty at Valparaiso University, and he has served as a past William S. Vaughan Visiting Fellow at Vanderbilt University. Heath is the author of Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago, which was runner-up in 2015 for the American Society of Church History's Brewer Prize. And he's been a co-editor of several books, including The Pew and the Picket Line and Turning Points in the History of American Evangelicalism. His current book project, On Earth as It Is in Heaven, Social Christians and the Fight to End American Inequality, reframes the story of the American social gospel, showing how a range of actors, women and men, Catholic and Protestant, Black and white and Latinx, have all powered the quest for a more egalitarian body politic. Kathryn Gin Lum is Associate Professor in the Religious Studies Department in collaboration with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University, where she also holds a courtesy appointment in history in affiliation with American Studies and Asian American Studies. Professor Gin Lum's scholarship and pedagogy, which specialize in the history of religion and race in American society, highlight the lived ramifications of religious beliefs. She received her BA in history from Stanford and her PhD in history from Yale, and is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Annenberg Faculty Fellowship for Outstanding Junior Faculty and the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching in the School of Humanities and Sciences. Kathryn's first book, Damned Nation, Hell in America from the Revolution to Reconstruction, examined how widely held beliefs about hell influenced Americans' perceptions of themselves and of the rest of the world. She's also the co-editor with Paul Harvey of the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Race in American History, and she's currently at work on a manuscript tentatively titled The Heathen World and America's Humanitarian Impulse, about which more to come. Now, as a preview of our format today, I'll be opening the conversation by posing several questions to Heath and Kathryn, and then about 2/3 of the way through, we'll begin incorporating some of your questions before aiming to conclude right at 3:30 p.m. Some of you included questions during the registration process, but we also invite participants to submit questions during the webinar using the Q&A function on your screen. So with all that established, I'll invite Heath and Kathryn to turn on their cameras. Welcome. Welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great to be here. And thank you for those kind introductions.
Absolutely. We're going to start our conversation today by discussing what drew you to working on this series. But I want to take just a moment to frame that even a bit more. I suspect that many in our virtual audience are familiar with your work already. I probably speak for several when I say that both Damned Nation and Union Made were on my qualifying exam list. So thanks for that. But in other words, you're trained historians, card-carrying members of the Academy, who are also balancing, ambitions at Eerdmans for this series to reach a broad audience. You've got a mandate to move some copies. So talk a bit for us about how you perceive biography contributing to the broader field of American religious history. In other words, what does biography do that, say, a monograph does not or cannot?
Well, I can start by just talking a little bit about how I got involved. I think when the press asked me if I would be interested in coming on board as a co-editor, this is a series that I knew about. I had read a number of the books in, and it was a series that had been around already by that point for 25 or so years. I had never thought of myself as necessarily seeking to be involved with a series like this. It wasn't, on my radar screen when I was in graduate school or as I started off my career on faculty. But I was intrigued by the opportunity to be involved with the series. And I think what I sort of figured out as I started to get involved with it was how much fun it is. Partly for the reason that you were just underscoring there, Philip, that it's a series that has from the very beginning brought scholars into play and many familiar names in our field, but also that's tried to reach wider audiences and to use biography as a means of getting folks who might not read Union Made or Damnation or might not, be sort of drawn to academic monographs to care about some of the major themes and issues that we engage with. And to me, that's sort of been a really fun part of it, along with just the opportunity to talk with folks and workshop ideas and think about, brainstorm with people, who would be interesting subjects? Oh, what about that? And so that part of it, I've also just really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. And in terms of the story of how I got involved in this, I have a one-word answer, Heath. Heath is very, very convincing. And I remember you called me up one day and said, hey, I have something to talk with you about. And I'd obviously heard a lot about this series from you over the years as part of our young scholars cohort. I remember you would constantly ask us, hey, if you had to write a religious biography, who would you write about? And it was just a fun exercise to think about that. And so when you came to me and said, do you want to be involved in co-editing the series, I thought, yeah, I'd love to. I think that sounds really interesting. And I've long had a kind of soft spot for biography. One of my favorite classes as an undergrad was this strange history class called Biography from the Greeks to VH1. And every week we would read a different biography. And at the end of the class, we actually got to write the biography of a fictional character, which was like totally wacky, but also a lot of fun. But yeah, I enjoy reading biographies because I think they often have a kind of strong storyline that a monograph might lack. And I actually wanted to be a creative writer before I wanted to be a historian or an academic. And I think one of the reasons that I'm drawn so much to biography is because it's like character-driven history, right? And you have to actually, you have to set the scene. It can lend itself to more creative writing than I think a standard monograph can allow. You really have to bring your main character to life. I think at its best, a good biography can operate like a good microhistory, right? It can use a character, it can use a single person to throw a window open onto the times that they lived in, the main issues that were at stake for them and their contemporaries, in a really readable, and I should also note, a highly teachable way. Like biographies, another reason why I think that they are really valuable for the field is that they are so accessible and they're so teachable, whether it's us reading one and then using that in our lectures or assigning them to students.
That's great, Kathryn.
Just to add on to something. Oh, can I just say one thing there? Sort of along the lines of what Kathryn was saying. As she was talking, I was reminded of a course that I took actually at Chicago. Jim Grossman and Kathy Conzen taught one of the best courses I ever took in graduate school on U.S. social history through biography, and it was exactly the kind of thing that Kathryn's talking about there in terms of, we read books about John Henry, about Deborah Sampson, Connecticut soldier, and these were ways of not, obviously of telling a compelling story about someone's life, but also just getting out into the times and kind of a way into much bigger stories.
That's great, Heath. And I'll take the moderator's prerogative to correct you and say, I'm sure you meant one of the best courses you took before you came to Notre Dame.
Obviously, I think that was assumed.
Qualified. But Kathryn, your ties with literature actually remind me of a book I just read by the historian Maya Jasanoff about Joseph Conrad, and she tracks these flows of globalization, and it really is it's avowedly attempting to make ties between literature and history in some interesting ways. I think we'll talk more probably even about teachability and the joy of biography in a moment, but I want to stay on this question of genre for just a second. I would suspect that by virtue of their participation today, our virtual guests are somewhat self-selecting as an audience, demonstrating by their participation here that they are at least open to biography. But the genre has its detractors, and I found some colorful examples for you. So some of that criticism centers upon ethics, right? Germaine Greer, for example, has called biography an unpardonable crime against personhood. And the New Yorker contributor Janet Malcolm has compared biographers to burglars, claiming that both writers and readers of biography, lest anyone in our audience think we're off the hook, both writers and readers are motivated by, quote, voyeurism and busybodyism. Other skeptics have focused on methodology. They say, doesn't the format necessarily buy into or even promote a great man or great woman theory of history? So I think these criticisms suggest several questions for us. Ethically, are there things biographers should just leave out, that they shouldn't touch? Methodologically, how can biographers work to connect their stories to stories of broad significance? And then just in your general assessment, what might be some weaknesses of the genre, and how can interested writers try to sidestep those pitfalls?
such good questions.
What do you think, Kathryn? You want to?
Yeah,
Those are great.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think it's totally true that biographies can get a bad rap. And I think there's a reason why, most dissertators are not encouraged to write biographies for their dissertations. I've been kind of toying with the idea of writing a biography at some point, but I had to wait till I got tenure. There's a reason for this. So yeah, I think, I don't know that I can answer all the questions all at once, but I think it's true that, biographies are often driven by market imperatives, and I think it's assumed that they have to be about recognizable figures in order to sell. And I think what that's often meant is that that they have really been so often about the so-called great men of history, right? I think in addition that biographers often get a bad rap for writing about their subjects as if their subjects are, head over heels above everyone else, that their subjects become kind of exemplary figures rather than exemplifying something about their times. And I think these issues kind of go hand in hand, right? The exemplary figure and the great man theory of history kind of takes as its subject a human being who is an unencumbered agent, who can go out into the world and change the world and is not themselves, shaped by the structures that are currently in existence. And I think that that weak biographies do not take into account the larger context, do not take into account the ways in which individuals are not just freestanding agents who can go out and change the world and make it into a different place, right? You have to take into account the structures, the context, the things that shape people to be who they are, and to enable them to act or not act in particular ways. I'm reminded here of Joe Lepore's 2001 Journal of American History essay, which it's called Historians Who Love Too Much: Reflections on Microhistory and Biography. I love this piece. I think she draws, too sharp a distinction between biography and microhistory. But I take her point about, what I'd consider to be weak biographies. And she says, actually pull this quote: "If biography is largely founded on a belief in the singularity and significance of an individual's life and his contribution to history, microhistory is founded upon almost the opposite assumption. However singular a person's life may be, the value of examining it lies not in its uniqueness, but in its exemplariness, in how that individual's life serves as an allegory for broader issues affecting the culture as a whole." So I think, why can't that also be the case for biographies? Like, why can't we blur that line? I think that if we do that, that addresses some of the issues that you raise about, about methodology, about the great man. And, I think that can be a way to think about this that doesn't fall into the traps that you named.
Yeah, that excerpt is great and reminds me of our very own Kathleen Cummings has often used, and I hope I'm not quoting her incorrectly, but the distinction between something being exceptional doesn't necessarily mean it's unique. And so you can use the exceptional sometimes to cast light on broader themes. Yep. But Heath, I cut you off. Your thoughts?
No, I agree with much of what Kathryn just said. I do think, to one of your early questions, biography as a genre certainly can fall into voyeurism. And certainly there are countless examples of that. I don't know that that's been a major issue in the series to this point. And I think in really good biography and the kinds of biographies that I think we've been interested in publishing and recruiting are biographies that are not just sort of chatty and looking to get into every corner of a person's life, so much as like what Kathryn was just saying, to use a life to illumine not just like every corner of that individual, but corners of the larger society. And so in some sense, I think there's a way to write biography that is, again, it's not exclusively or primarily, I don't want to say not primarily, but it's about a person's life, but it's about so much more than that. And so you don't fall down to the bunny trail of kind of pursuing every gossipy sort of lead necessarily. I think to another one of Kathryn's points about, the market, I think one of the things as an editor that I've been really interested in with the series is pushing to be able to include and to move toward including more and more subjects that are not as well known. And I think that's a struggle because we are a series and we're, collaborating with a press that does want to sell copies, and I think that's a worthy goal. I think one of the examples that I think of from the field that would be an example of how a really well written biography or microhistory can both be really strong and sell. I mean, a book like The Kingdom of Matthias is a great example. I mean, most people have never heard of any of the characters in that book. But I would imagine, I mean, just anecdotally, it's got to be one of the most taught books in the field over the last, 20 years or so. So I guess, my hope is that we can really push in that direction and explore kind of the horizons of the genre, the ability to bring in people that you wouldn't typically think of as subjects for a biography.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Well, this is a perfect segue. I'm only slightly paranoid that you have someone in the room looking over my shoulder, because I wanted to move from these kind of meta questions about biography to a focus on your series specifically, and with a specific focus on the shape of the series over time. So for those who don't know, Eerdmans, the company, was founded by a student at what was then Calvin College before it became Calvin University, situated right there in the heart of Dutch Reformed America. And many of the early titles in the series focused on Protestant clerics. Now, the series has evolved a bit over the years, a great example of which is Paul Harvey's volume on the theologian Howard Thurman, which we want to take a moment to celebrate and commend with you, since it was just selected as a publisher's.
I've got a little copy of it right here, and if you
excellent puppet. Yeah, Publishers Weekly Book of the Week. But just tell us a bit, for those of us who know a little less, tell us about how the evolution has taken shape, and specifically where you see this series headed in the years to come.
Well, I can start on that one, and then Kevin, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Philip, that in its origins, the series tended to focus more on white Protestant men, many of whom were clergy, some of whom were sort of, tend to fall into the kind of great man sort of figures. And obviously there were some early exceptions to that, you have a book on someone like a Catholic like Thomas Merton, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, was, I think, one of the really strong volumes in the series before I got involved. But I think as the field has shifted, and with since I got involved, and Kathryn as well, we've wanted the series to really reflect the sort of mainstream of the field, and to sort of better reflect and better live into its own name. I mean, the name of the series is The Library of Religious Biography, and I think we had begun to sort of move in that direction, and we're trying to really steer the ship to really reach, to be broader, not just, obviously in terms of the religious tradition of the subjects, gender and race and class, also geographical variety. I mean, we've had an overwhelming number of subjects from the United States. We'd love to branch out there. There's certainly nothing in the, rule book that says we have to just focus exclusively on American subjects. So I think that's part of what we've been working on, and Paul's new book on Howard Thurman is a great example of that. Signing up Kara Burnage to work on Elizabeth Cady Stanton, really excited about that book. We've got books coming out down the line on Aretha Franklin and Tina Turner, and so I think really just trying to kind of reach for a broader array of subjects, and also array of authors. And I think that's the other piece there, is to really recruit a wider diversity of authors that sort of fully reflects the state of the field.
Yeah, I would just echo kind of all of what you said, and I would say, that's the pitch that you gave me when you when you asked me to sign on, and so I really do see a lot of promise in the future. I'm really excited about the books that we have, Paul Harvey's book, the books that we have coming out in the pipeline, and I think one of the things that we've talked about as editors is that we have to find kind of the balance between the household names because of the market imperatives. And, you know, a good religious biography of a household name is great too, right? There's nothing, I don't want to denigrate that in any way. But I think also that those kinds of biographies, you know, a biography of a president, for instance, can really carry perhaps in terms of the market, or allow us to expand and, you know, take a risk on a name who might not be a household name. And I think one of the roles that Heath and I have as editors is to convince, or to try to convince the press that, you know, hey, this person might not be well known, but there is a market for a biography, or, you know, a biography that's like a microhistory of this person that can become a classroom name, right? That can become kind of the next Kingdom of Matthias, that kind of book that'll just be taught. You know, I'm thinking about like Rebecca Proughton or Minocchio, like these kinds of characters that it's not a president, but in the hands of an author who can tell a good story and who can, you know, make a kind of claim about the field through the life of a person. This can be a book that can sell. And so I think that's constantly what we're trying to do, is trying to balance, you know, the books that we know will sell because of the market, and then using those books to take risks on other possibilities.
That's excellent. Thank you. So we're going to get even more practical here. We've been talking, you know, kind of big picture biography, big picture of the series, but I'm assuming we have some aspiring writers who are part of our audience today. So let's talk to folks who might be nursing ideas for a pitch. Do you have any advice for people working on a proposal as they develop this document for you? What should they definitely do? And are there any mistakes they should try to avoid that would turn you off?
I mean, I think one of the things I would say is that we're very easily sort of approached and happy to always just sort of talk very casually about ideas. And I think oftentimes that's an easy, people should feel free to email us and reach out, and we're happy to sort of workshop ideas in a kind of informal way before people go to the work of drawing up a formal proposal. And we also, we're happy to share sample proposals and sort of demystify that whole process. I think in general, one of the things that often happens sort of at the beginning is an author will send one of us a paragraph pitch, you know, sort of very brief description of a character that they'd like to write about and why, and how they, you know, how they might imagine sort of casting that person in a book. And that's an opportunity for then the series editors and the press to kind of talk together about both, is this a potential fit with the series, and then also maybe to also give the person some feedback and some ideas about how, as they go about crafting that proposal, to do that. So I think the main thing that I would emphasize is just an openness to conversation. We will really probably never just turn you away outright. You know, we really would love to, you know, even if one subject doesn't work, we're always happy to talk with people about other possibilities and really advocate for potential authors and potential projects.
Yeah, that's totally right. Just being in touch, you know, kind of from the initial tweet to a full-fledged proposal. And yeah, it's tough right now because we're not on the conference circuit, right? Everybody's just at home. So a lot of times these conversations just happen as you're, you know, casually meeting in the hallways or something like that outside of a panel. But you know, there are ways. There are downfalls to social media, but there are positive too, right? Like, we can be reached. So please do reach out to us. And then, yeah, you know, I think some of the issues that we were talking about in terms of the pitfalls of biography apply also to proposals, right? And one of the things that we didn't get into too much was the historian who loves too much that Lepore talks about, right? So I think oftentimes biographers are accused of loving their subjects so much that biographies can turn into like hagiographies. Right? I never know how to pronounce that word. Is it hagiography or hagiography? Anyway,
Hagiography, yeah.
Hagiography, whatever.
I don't know.
Right. So a biography can go in that direction, and I think that what can cause it to go in that direction is an assumption that everybody cares about your figure as much as you do. And so one of the things that's really important to do in a pitch and a proposal is to tell don't assume that they care, right? So tell us why we should care about your subject and about their religious lives, right? It's not enough to say that no one has looked at a subject in this particular way before. I think it's important to tell us why that matters, right?
So in many ways, I mean, we've spent a little time talking about the distinctions between monographs and biographies, and we'll probably return to that in a moment. But in many ways here, the challenge is the same as for any person writing. Like that's the grad student's fallacy is always just find the gap and lean on the gap and lean on the gap. And you have to say, maybe there's a gap because no one cares. Tell me why. Tell me why people care. Exactly. Right. Just on the note of, you've mentioned reaching out to the two of you. Is email to the two of you the best route? Is there a website folks should pursue? I've gotten a few questions about, style preferences for the series, citations, etc. If people have questions about that, again, is that something they should contact you directly, or is there a primer online they could peruse?
We need to create a primer, actually.
Yeah.
That would be a good idea. So that some of these kinds of questions we can sort of refer people to that. We don't have one right now. I would say that, any sort of logistical questions, folks can feel free to email us. And we're happy to field all different sorts of questions. I mean, the only thing I would add, just sort of in general, about sort of proposals, and as people are thinking about the kinds of books that we're interested in. I mean, I do think that we really are interested in like the quality of writing, and I think like really well written books that the audience here is not a dissertation committee. It is sort of a person outside of our field. I mean, we want these books to be books that might be taught in undergraduate classrooms. We want them to be taken seriously by scholars, but we really want them to also be broadly accessible to non-experts. And so I think that's another advantage of the genre, actually, is that it's a genre that does lend itself to storytelling and to leaning into sort of the details of people's lives as a way to get back out of those lives. And so to the extent that people are able to lean into story as a way of getting at, I mean, many times scholars want to make theoretical points, they want to make historiographical points, and I think we welcome that in the series, but we want them, whenever possible, to do that really through the story. So that's something we're already looking for at the proposal level is, can this person write? And does this person have a sense of how to tell a good story?
Yep, totally. I mean, I think biographies have, they share a lot with narrative history in that regard, right? That you can use the narrative to convey an argument. You don't have to like hit the reader over the head with it, in the beginning. So yeah, and we are looking for that. I think oftentimes, grad students writing dissertations will say, oh, I want to write a book that my mom can read or something like that. And I have to say that with biographies, I think that's totally right, right? We want these to be books that have this wide kind of crossover audience. And one of the things that I sometimes advise authors is, use the biography as the kind of narrative history, tell the argument through the story, and you can write an article that relates to the biography that does the more theoretical work in a more overt way, right? It's not like you're done with the subject just because you've written this one biography. There are multiple different ways, different genres that you can use to make different sorts of claims.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad you referenced grad students again, Kathryn. I should clarify and apologize. So when I invoked the grad student's fallacy, I say that as a very recent grad student myself, and just remembering my own experience in seminars. So no criticisms implied of the vibrant grad student community. In just a moment, we're going to transition to some audience Q&A. But as we head there, I wonder, you told us at the start a bit about what drew you to this series in the abstract. But concretely, is there any way it's changed your own work as scholars? Are there benefits you've gleaned from the practice of serving as a series editor?
It's a fun question. I don't know, Kathryn, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't been involved in it as long as you have, and I have to say my involvement came right before I had a baby, and then the pandemic. So I've been, it's been a challenging year for everyone. But I guess what I would say is that being involved in the series has really made me think about characters in my own writing in a different way. I mean, the kinds of writing that I've done so far have been really kind of far afield from biography. I've written books that, range over time, that have multiple different characters in them. But I think being involved in this series has made me just think about, I don't want to just write about like, oh, so-and-so wrote this article in whatever year. Now let's focus on the article. It's made me really think about, okay, let's find something about this person, right? Let's be able to say something about the character, even within the strictures of a monograph. So I think it's made me more attentive to that. And partly also because I still like toy with this idea of, if I were to write a religious biography, who would I write a biography of? And so for all of the characters that I've been dealing with in my current work, I've been thinking, what possibilities are there for this particular character? And so I've got a lot of ideas, and they're all like not at all household names, so probably wouldn't fly, but it's still been interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting. I mean, I've actually, the book I'm working on right now is sort of a bigger, 100-year national sort of story. And I would say two things about that. One is, there's times when I'm working on it when I'm like, I wish I was doing a biography, because it would just feel a little bit more.
Me too.
I mean, my book feels unwieldy and hard to manage and whatnot. And there's something that feels sort of nice to me, at least in the abstract, about having a person's life to contain the story. But I also know, and I guess notice, and as you're asking this question, that, I mean, one of the ways that I'm trying to make this story work in the book I'm working on right now is to get at larger things through particular characters and try to use characters to get out to. So I'm not, it's not a book that's primarily about, one or two people, but it is at some level using that sort of methodology. And I don't know if that's like a direct impact of the series, but it was definitely sort of a strategic choice that I had to make somewhere along the lines. How am I going to actually tell a story this big in a book that has limited words? And that's where I've kind of fallen. And so I think maybe, it could be that partly through reading so many proposals and book manuscripts for the series that that was involved. I don't know.
Great. So let's go ahead and segue. And again, you've teed me up. I'm channeling Notre Dame's own John McGreevy here when I use the terminology that, for the reasons you just say, all the proposals the two of you have read and the depth with which you've thought about this, you have thought as much about religious biography as probably nearly anyone in the world. And some of the questions we've gotten recognize that. So let's assume all the biographies in your series are at the top, excluding those. And excluding, we've talked about the Kingdom of Matthias, Minocchio, the Shoes and Worms. What's one biography that you've read that you would recommend to readers, or that has helped shape the way you think about the genre? Joseph Stewart submitted that question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Anything come right to mind for you?
I mean, one of the biographies that I remember reading in grad school that I really enjoyed, because I was in the middle of reading for general exams, and monographs they're great, but when you're reading them again and again and again, a biography can really break things up. And that was Debbie Applegate's biography of Henry Ward Beecher. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read it, but I remember the impact that it made on me at the time, reading it in the context of all of these other monographs, and thinking, wow, what can you do with a biography that is deeply contextualized? Yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, this is such a toughie for me. I'll say, just because it's on my mind, and I mentioned it a little bit ago, that, reading, I love Scott Nelson's John Henry biography, which is not a religious biography, but to me was so enticing when I read it as a kind of example of a really accessible biography of, it's a biography of the character of John Henry, who's, famous, featured in a kind of railroad song from the 19th century. And Nelson goes and figures out that he argues that John Henry was a real person, and sort of dives into the contours of his life and uses it to explore kind of themes of race and class in the 19th century. And to me, it's just it's sort of journalistically written. You know, it's an easy read, but it also, I think, showcases how you can, you know, both the fun of a character and the fun of kind of making public like the methodology that a biographer uses and the questions that one is able to answer and unable to answer about an individual's life and what it sheds light on about kind of the nation.
Great, thank you. Two participants have sent along questions related regarding exactly what is religious in religious biography. So Daniel Silliman, an old friend around these parts, now news editor at Christianity Today and instructor in the humanities at Milligan College, and I think an author in your series. He asks, how does it affect religious biography that a lot of people are inconsistently religious during their lives? What are some good ways to deal with conflicting evidence regarding the authenticity of someone's faith? And then another old friend of Notre Dame's, Jonathan Riddle from Wheaton College, he notes that religion has often been used polemically, you know, to demarcate what's legitimate and what's not. So how do you decide which historical subjects warrant treatment as religious biographies?
Those are great questions.
Good questions, yeah.
Let's see what to say. I mean, I think with respect to the first one, I think we're really open to the ways that people want to think about the religious dimensions of someone's life and legacy. I think about a manuscript that I just read earlier this fall, Chris Geertz's biography of Charles Lindbergh, who is exactly that kind of figure that kind of moves across both these questions, actually, in the sense of someone who's you know, got a kind of clear lineage back into kind of German Lutheran, Swedish, I think, Lutheran churches, but who sort of becomes ambiguously religious. I mean, when Chris was first writing about Lindbergh, he was thinking about him as sort of an example, early example of the spiritual but not religious kind of figure. And then someone who also has, you know, really, really deeply troubling, problematic, even, I mean, you could say heinous connections to eugenics, to, you know, at least indirectly to Nazism. And so Chris, I think in that book does a nice job of both trying to underscore the ways in which, you know, growing up in the kind of home that Lindbergh grew up in and whatnot shaped his life and thought. But he's not, I mean, it's definitely not a celebration of Lindbergh's, you know, religious or spiritual, but not religious life exactly. It's a sort of contextualization, critical engagement with it. And I think underscoring though, and to kind of circle back, the ways in which, you know, a kind of Christian gloss on eugenics and whatnot is actually really common in society in Lindbergh's life. And it's important for audiences today to understand the intersections of Christianity and eugenics and white supremacy and how, you know, hard to imagine something more timely. So we're not looking for people who, you know, want to kind of give either really sort of nostalgic takes on what religion is, or to sort of gloss over the really terrible aspects in some cases of its role in our history. But Lindbergh to me is an example of someone who's on the one hand sort of elusive religiously, but also religion is important and sometimes in really deeply troubling ways.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, I think paying deep attention to the context, you know, in just the way that the Lindbergh biography does, means that it's not the job of the biographers to really determine, you know, whether a person's proclaimed religious faith is authentic or not, I think. And I think that, you know, if we set aside the question of authenticity, I think deeply contextualizing what a person says about themselves and what is said about them, you know, can help address these issues, right? So yeah, again, like kind of making the biography more along the lines of a microhistory. and using these very questions to illuminate, why are people asking about this figure's religiosity, or why are they using religion to try to hold a person up or to take them down? Like, why is that the case? That tells us something about their times, not just about the person themselves. And that's, I think that helps us to kind of move beyond the really difficult question of authenticity.
Excellent.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add, just in response to the question in general, that kind of ties back to an earlier question about the evolution of the series. I think at the outset in the early 90s, religion as a field was more marginal within the context of sort of American history, within history circles more generally. And so I hope, I guess, that, I think religious history has moved much closer to the mainstream in the last 30 years. And we want the series to sort of reflect that. So you aren't going to just see only clergy featured in our series, but people from across society. And again, not only thinking about religious influence or legacy and sort of the most direct sense, but also in a variety of other kind of complex senses. And we really invite and welcome that. And I think that's sort of where the field has gone and where we hope to go.
Excellent. It was fun to hear your update on Chris's project, because as a pure coincidence, we bumped into each other in New Haven in June 2018, both working at archives there. So fun to hear that that's come along. A few questions have come in specifically to the series. So both Dorothy Bass and Scott Culpepper have asked any subjects, any historical actors that you would really like to see profiled in the Eerdmans series.
So many.
Yeah.
A non-exhaustive list, any that come to mind.
Do you want to take this one
first? I wonder if
this,
would this be something to, we were talking about putting together some sort of a document with information, and I wonder if it would actually be helpful to have kind of a running list of names. We keep on going back and forth. I remember the first dinner that we had once you brought me on, we were just brainstorming all of these names that we thought would be just fantastic. And then on Twitter, I know that you're constantly tweeting who would we like to see as part of the series.
Yeah, I mean, I do use Twitter to sort of brainstorm a little bit with folks about what sometimes I ask people, and other times folks tweet at me, which is always fun. I mean, some of the ones that come to mind that I've kind of had conversations about recently, someone like Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a Moody Bible grad and went on to become the highest ranking Black official in the New Deal. I remember a while back on Twitter, Jeff Chu pushed us to think again kind of more internationally. And what about a biography of Chiang Kai-shek, or of kind of I'm trying to think about other folks that we've recently talked about. Karl Marx and Darwin. I mean, these would be fascinating kinds of figures. Fannie Lou Hamer is someone that I've had conversations with folks about and would love to see featured in the series. So I mean, I think it's easy for me to get excited about a really, really wide range of potential folks. And sometimes I'm just reading a book and realizing like, oh, this person's so interesting. I'll tweet it out and say, who wants to write a religious biography of this person? So if you've got ideas out there, and I mean, like I said, just feel free to reach out, and we're really open.
Yep.
Great. Beth Schweiger and Elizabeth Lynch have both asked about documentation. Do you prefer notes on sources? Do you use footnotes, endnotes? How should people think as they're preparing, mentally to achieve this?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes up, and that there has been some evolution. I think early on in the series, oftentimes books would have like a short bibliographic essay at the end without notes. I think we've moved, and I like actually moving back toward a kind of spare set of notes that helps people who are maybe meeting this figure to understand where they might go to read more and to get access to those contexts. So I think we're not looking for 2-page long, really dense scholarly apparatus at the end of the book. But having some notes, I think, is important and kind of the direction we've been moving.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, numerous folks have chimed in with questions about tensions within the academy. So this will maybe circle us back a bit to things we've discussed, but I think give you more room to expound too. I'll just list a few versions of what, I think we could almost call like the Ron Chernow, Lin-Manuel Miranda question. What do we make of the fact that historians often love monographs, or especially you'll hear people say, don't expect to get tenure, writing a biography. But that lay readers often love biographies, lay readers and students. Kathryn, you mentioned teaching. And for anyone who was not able to join us for an event earlier this month, Leslie Woodcock Tentler, the esteemed historian, talked about her most recent book, and specifically the stylistic decision she had made to open each of 5 sections with a biographical capsule. And her justification for that was, I've taught for decades, and like the most hardened, uninterested students in the back row will perk up when I start focusing on an individual life. And Heath, you mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. I taught here last fall. The day I focused on Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the students were rapt, not because I'm a great teacher. It's just a gripping story. So how do you handle this conflict between kind of the idealized conception of what scholarship is and the practical needs of connecting to your audience? Specifically, do you want to, are you imagining your work here as an intervention in the field and not just to readers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be, absolutely. I think that, I think the distinction that you make, that historians tend to prefer the monograph and not so much the biography, is true. But I really like the work that tries to blur those lines. And so, the genre that you just mentioned, or the format that you just mentioned, opening each section with a biographical capsule, is that's like a brilliant way of kind of blending or melding the two possibilities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that our work on this series is trying to show that there is a place for biographies that, appeal to a general audience, but these kind of crossover works that can make, academic interventions as well. Like, absolutely. But I don't think that it's, just this series that can do that kind of work. I think it's also like precisely the kind of monograph that challenges the conventions, that brings biography in, that can do that as well. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I do hope at some level, I mean, one of the things that has been interesting to me, I think I've been involved for 4.5 years or right around there. And I think there's an opportunity also for potential authors to sort of shape the series, which I hope does, sort of shape, I don't know if shape the field, but, that it reflects the field, is part of kind of engagement between the field and wider publics. It's been fun to me. I mean, I hope it's come through, very clearly here that we're really open to what folks' interests are, and the kind, we since I've come on board, we've certainly recruited different kinds of books, different kinds of subjects. Some are more traditional biographies, others are I think going to be, and part of it, I mean, it's fun, to have Paul's book come out, because it was one of the first ones that we signed up after I got involved. And so it's sort of fun to see a book all the way through that process. But I guess I hope that I don't have a really hard and fast vision of like what the series is becoming per se. And I think that will partly depend on who pitches us and who they pitch. And, we are pushing for, as we spoke about earlier, sort of a wider array of subjects and authors. But beyond that, I don't know what it's going to, I mean, in the last 6 or 8 months, we've had a kind of little burst of pop culture has come forward. And it's fun to see that happen with an Aretha Franklin and a Tina Turner and whatnot. But who knows what may be coming down the pike. And I hope to sort of continue to be surprised by that. And I think, yeah, like Kathryn said, to sort of challenge too hard and fast boundaries between what counts for the field and what, I mean, I think, we've talked a couple of times just sort of obliquely about, I think it is a challenging task for a doctoral student or a really early career person to take on a biography before tenure, just because the genre is it's a challenging genre, I think, and it's hard to do it well and do it right. So I think I was cautioned, and I think it's wise for people to be cautious doing this too early in one's career. But as you feel drawn to it, I think it can be a great way. Many people I know are interested in kind of working between academy and other publics, and I hope that the series is one place that they find they can do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of the authors that I've spoken with who are getting involved in this series, I think that they're really attentive to the kinds of problems that we've been talking about, to some of the pitfalls of biography. But on the other hand, they're also really attentive to the pitfalls of monographs. Right? We haven't really talked about that, as also there are issues with that as well, right? And so I think that they're excited about the possibilities that working on biography kind of in this context can bring. And and I think that they're willing to kind of experiment with it and use their central subjects to do the kind of work that we've been talking about, right? So yeah, I'm really excited about what's coming.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a really enriching time together. We need to start to wind down, but I do have one more question before we go. We've focused almost this entire time on the series. I would love, and I'm sure that our audience would too, to hear just in a bit more detail than I offered in the introduction about what you're working on individually at the moment.
Go for it, Kathryn.
Okay. So I'm working on this book. It's called The Heathen World and America's Humanitarian Impulse, or at least that's the tentative title. And it is like the complete opposite of a biography. It goes from the beginning of time. No, not really, but it goes from very, very early to the present day. So it's a kind of wide, like synthetic overview of the concept or the figure of the heathen. And I'm in particular interested in looking at how ideas about religious difference, how they coincide with racial difference or notions of racial difference, and how they inform notions of racial difference. And so I'm really looking at this over this broad chronology to try to understand both what changes over time, but also what stays the same. So I'm really interested in continuity as well as change. But I've found some really interesting characters in the course of doing the research for this book. And so I'm playing around with what I might do with those characters going forward.
And I'm working on a sort of attempt to rethink the story of American social Christianity. And it's sort of an old theme in our field, but one that is a little, I think, muddled at the moment, partly because there's this old story that revolves around Walter Rauschenbusch and sort of his circle. And then in the last generation, there's been sort of lots of books and articles, monographs and journal articles on sort of local stories of women and social gospels, the Black social gospel, but not a sort of attempt to sort of rethink the whole. And so I'm trying to do that and to tell a story of kind of how battles around the kind of idea of equality became really important in sort of wider American Christian circles in the kind of long century from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, and sort of trying to tell a story of an American social Christian tradition. I'm thinking of it as it's sort of a fractious thing, but also a really important thing in terms of shaping the nation during that long season. So, like I said, unwieldy, but I'm making progress and happy with how it's coming along. So.
Well, I appreciate those summaries. I mean, I'd been excited reading those, brief descriptions on your websites, but I'm even more so now. Unfortunately, I need to start winding it down. I would just say one more time on behalf of everyone at the Cushwa Center, as well as our many virtual guests, to both of you, thanks so much for sharing your time and your vision for this exciting series. And then to everyone who joined us today, from all of us here on the 4th floor in Getty's Hall, we extend our wishes for a wonderful afternoon and evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.